Welcome back, it's me, Lou. I'm here for another action figure unboxing and review, and today we are looking at the main man himself, the very popular DC character known as Lobo. Okay, so I'm very excited about this figure. Number one, big fan of the McFarlane DC Multiverse line. As the line progresses, we're getting more and more characters that do not have to deal with Batman or Superman. McFarlane Toys, they're finally branching out and giving us a lot of actual DC Universe characters. Some of the more recent characters they've given us that aren't related to Batman or Superman are like Swamp Thing. We got Dr. Fate a few months ago. And this figure right here that we're looking at, Lobo. I'm a huge fan of Lobo. I believe I was in high school. I might have been a freshman in high school when the first issue came out of the miniseries, which we have right here. And this was dated back in November of 1990. And for me, this was my introduction to the character Lobo. The comic book was written by Keith Giffen and Alan Grant with art by Simon Bisley. This was one of those comics that, not that necessarily changed my life, but this was maybe around the peak of the anti-hero era in comic books. So characters like the Punisher was really big. Even though he's kind of he's a superhero, Wolverine. In my opinion, he kind of borderlines on anti-hero. And DC gave us Lobo. He was a character that existed previously, but they updated his look. They made him more outrageous, more wild. He was almost like DC's answer to Wolverine, but I don't know, kind of with a much more heavy metal twist. And it was a cool comic book. I love this comic book a lot. Great character, and ever since the early 90s, I've just been a big fan of Lobo. He's had a couple of action figures over the years. One of the more recent ones was the Storm Collectibles Lobo figure that I believe came out last year. That was one I pre-ordered, but then at a certain point I just dropped my pre-order because I think for a second I thought I was gonna not necessarily bow out of collecting figures, but I was kind of slowing down, and I think I was a little bit more focused on Transformers, and the superhero stuff wasn't really doing anything for me. So I'm like, you know what, I'm just gonna drop the pre-order. And I've kind of regretted it because the Storm Collectibles Lobo looks amazing, but it was just a little too pricey, and I wasn't really into that line to begin with. Storm Collectibles, they make great action figures, but a lot of them are focused more on video games and fighting games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and it's ironic because I'm a huge arcade fighting fan. But I just couldn't pull the trigger on those action figures because the price point is a little too high. And even though they made a Lobo, it's I was kind of on board, but then I dropped out. And I'm kicking myself now because I think the prices for that figure now is kind of high. So that was one of the more recent Lobo figures we've gotten. If you're a DC Classics fan, Mattel gave us a Lobo figure years ago. This was many years ago. It was a Build-A-Figure, and the figure was beautiful. But the downside to that figure was that once you assembled the figure, the scale was ridiculous. The character was just gigantic. He towered over most of the classic figures. And if you're familiar with Lobo, he's a big and buff guy, but he's not one that's tall. So it's kind of weird that the Build-A-Figure was so gigantic and out of scale with the rest of the line. But that's a figure that I really wanted, but at the time I just had the hardest time trying to find any of those figures to build the Build-A-Figure. So unfortunately I don't have that one either. So for me, having the McFarlane Toys Lobo come out in this day and age is kind of a godsend to me. I love the character. The McFarlane stuff never fails to impress me. Every release is better than the last, and I'm all on board. This figure looks fantastic, but right away I can tell you there might be a couple things I might have issues with, but we'll get into that as we look at the figure. But first off, I just wanted to kind of share my little history with the character. Like I said, I was a big fan of Lobo growing up. This comic was amazing, and this is a very special comic also. This is actually the first appearance of Lobo in the comic books, And this is from the Omega Men. This was issue number 3, and way back when this was like only $1. So this is one of my prized collectibles in my comic book collection. I don't have like a lot of big, like super expensive comics, and this is definitely not a big super expensive comic. You know, I have a couple of important issues here and there. Like I have the first appearance of Deadpool. I have the original first Walking Dead. But this is one of those books that, even though it's not worth a whole lot of money, I'm just so stoked on the character that I'm glad I have his, you know, actual first appearance in the first print book, and it's very awesome and it's very special to me. So let's move ahead and actually look at the figure. So what we have here is Lobo as part of the DC Multiverse line from McFarlane Toys, and I just got this today. It's December 8th, 2021. I got it through Amazon. I believe the total price I paid for it, including shipping, was maybe $31.98, and I think that was with like a 2-day delivery. So I don't remember how much I paid for the figure by itself before tax and before shipping. Maybe it was like $21, $22. But yeah, we have Lobo here. He looks great. The standard McFarlane packaging for the DC Multiverse line is that giant cardboard rectangle. And this is Lobo as he appears in DC Rebirth. So this is the more recent iteration of the character. And he's one of those characters that he's changed looks throughout the decades, but it's never anything super drastic. Like, there's a lot of elements here that are carried over from the old 90s Lobo, which I'm glad, because there was a time period when they kind of updated his look. Like, if you remember, during the late 90s, early 2000s, they kind of gave Lobo a much more like Rob Zombie sort of look. He had like the longer dreads. He kind of had, I believe he had, like, instead of having this like leather jacket with the torn sleeves, it might have been like a leather trench coat. So he's always had a character that they'll try updating his look every now and then, but for the most part, you know, he always has that trademark color, like pale white skin. He has the I'm not sure if it's necessarily war paint or if it's actually like facial markings that they're born with. So he has that. He has the red eyes. One of the things that always seems to carry over in any redesign of Lobo is he always has the skull belt buckle. And of course, let's not forget, he has the giant hook and chain. That's kind of like his trademark weapon, and it's a very iconic piece that's always associated with the character. On the back, really, really nice fig photography here. Personally, like I've said many times, I would have preferred it if they went back and just gave us the comic book illustration of the character alongside with, like, you know, which comic book it was, the artist who drew it, and whatnot. But I've learned to accept the fact that this is what we're going to get from now on. But in terms of fig photography, it's a beautiful image. Some other figures that are currently out, we have Shriek from Batman Beyond. There's the Sean Gordon Murphy Bat-Cycle. There's the McFarlane-designed Wonder Woman, King Shazam, and Dr. Fate. Dr. Fate's awesome. These other four, I still have to either purchase or review. I might get that in due time, but right now, with the McFarlane line, the figures, you know, we see new figures on a consistent basis, which is a great thing. But at the same time, you know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, especially if you collect more than just one toy line. So for certain toy lines of McFarlane, I have to like cherry pick which figures I want. I'm not going to run out and just buy the complete waves. But you know, like I said, every figure I've purchased of McFarlane, they've always been very impressive, and I've never been disappointed. So let's take a look at Lobo. Okay, so first impressions of the figure while it's in the tray. It looks great, but like I said, as excited as I am for this figure, I have a couple of issues with it. One thing that I want to alleviate off the minds of other collectors is that, so when the early stock or promotional photos were first revealed of Lobo, one thing a lot of collectors pointed out was how come Lobo's hair is blue. So one thing I could at least reassure you is that the figure does not necessarily have completely blue hair, like was seen in the promotional photos. Like if you saw the promotional photos, the hair just looked more blue than black. Where in this case, the hair definitely looks more black than blue. The actuality is that it's black hair with blue highlights. And it's okay. For me, I can accept that just because as a longtime comic book fan and reader, if you go back, even like way back when in the 70s and 80s, and it still kind of holds true today, a lot of superheroes who have predominantly like darker or like black hair, often what they do in comic books is that they'll use blue as the highlight. And that's the case here, but for some reason it doesn't translate well, as a 3D figure. But I can at least reassure you that on the actual figure, the hair is more black than blue. It's that certain parts of the hair are just looking like blue highlight. So that's kind of cool. I could dig that. But I do have an issue with that just because on the trading card and also on the fig photography image, it looks like it's black hair with gray highlights. So if you asked me, what do I prefer more? I'd prefer if he actually had black hair with gray highlights. I feel that the gray, it's a little bit more muted, and aesthetically it flows with the figure better. But the blue is not bad. It just kind of pulls your eye right away towards it. Just because a lot of the rest of the character is so dulled and muted. Like he has a lot of silvers, he has a lot of grays. Even his jeans, the denim, the blue here is a little bit more subtle than the highlights in his hair. So the blue highlights, it does draw your attention, but at the same time, it's not overpowering the black. So I could kind of forgive them on that, although I do wish he had gray highlights like on the box here and on the trading card. Because I do think the gray highlights against the black, this aesthetically makes for a better looking figure. And then real quick, here's the trading card. We get that, and of course you get a display stand. So those are all the accessories that come in the box besides his awesome chain. Okay, so let's take Lobo out. Or just bear with me for a moment. I'm trying to remove the figure from the tray without. I don't want to accidentally cut the tie that comes with them. If I could, I want to preserve it, so I'm just gonna try to thread it out the best that I can. Alright, so we have Lobo, the main man. The hard thing with him, trying to film him, is that the light that comes off his face, it makes everything look blown out. So you might not see all the details. Let me see if I can adjust my lighting a little so it's not as bright. Alright, so that's a little bit better. Yeah, because I want to make sure that we can capture all his detail, because he's a beautifully sculpted figure, and the fact that his face is white, it's not agreeing with my lighting. So my light just wants to just blow everything out, so all the details get washed away. Alright, so I think let's try to get him at an angle where we can get all the details. Alright, so this is the best I could do right now. And as you can see, the detailing is beautiful. There's some nice sculpting on his arms. There's a beautiful texture too. Even though his arms are bare skinned, they do a wonderful job of sculpting in all this texture and all this hair on his arms, and it's His arms are also very vascular looking, so you get some really clean musculature with some vein work. He has some wraps towards the bottom of his forearms, nice gloves. While his head and face are still in focus, he has a nice grin, nice wide chin. His beard's sculpted neatly. You can see his teeth. One eye is more open than the other, which is very reminiscent of the comic book. He's kind of squinting with the other eye. His undershirt has a nice ribbed pattern onto it. Likewise, his leather jacket, really, really clean and sharp texture all throughout. It really gives you that kind of like worn leathered look. Same with the sleeves being torn off, you get these nice fringes that are ripped on this where the seams should be. There's some nice spikes towards the top. The denim, really beautiful texture. Some really nice folding over here and wrinkles. On the back, this is one thing I was really hoping for. He has the Bite Me Fanboy patch on the back of his vest. This is one of the iconic imagery that's associated with Lobo. Like with that miniseries I just showed you, I believe it was one of the issues. The cover itself was just, you were just looking at Lobo's back, and it just said "Bite Me Fanboy," and that was kind of like became his trademark saying in terms of like anytime you saw the character, "Bite Me Fanboy." That was so Lobo. That was, you know, so 90s. This was kind of like what you associated the character with. You know, this. Just seeing his back alone, this was actually one of the covers to one of the comic books. So for me, this is kind of like a highlight seeing this in figure form. It looks great. Again, I just love how muscular the figure is. You know, it really embodies the fact that this is a really burly and buff guy. And he's so grizzled looking. He looks so worn and beat up and grizzled. And I don't know, this screams like wild, crazy space biker, which Lobo is. His gloves, he has some rivets here, some armor plating on top. His knuckles are covered with guards also. Alright, so one thing that does bother me, you might not catch this on the camera. This is something you'll only notice if you handle the figure in person, is that the flesh tone on his face is completely different than the flesh tone on his body. The camera's not going to capture it just because of lighting, but if you hold this figure in hand, his face is actually pale white, whereas his neck and his arms, they're actually a very light shade of gray. So it's kind of disjointing because it almost looks like he's a gray character with white face paint. And if you're familiar with Lobo, he's from the planet, I think Zarnia. So he's actually a Zarnian. And Zarnians, they're very like albino-like. They're very pale, white-skinned. And so that's kind of throwing me off because Lobo does not have white face paint. He just has white skin. Whereas the skin on this action figure is actually gray. You might be able to notice it right here. Like if you look here at the head and the face, it's really white, but then his arms and neck are very gray. So that's kind of disjointing. You know, I would have liked it if they were just consistent about it. You know, either have his arms and his neck be the same shade of white as his face, or have his face be the same shade of gray as the rest of him. But yeah, Lobo's a very stark white character. So it's just, for me, it's just kind of weird that his arms and his neck aren't sculpted in like a basic plain white. Because when I first saw him and looked at him, my first thought was that gray kind of reminds me of lighter shade of tone that they used for like the McFarlane Devastator figure, which kind of looks like Doomsday. It's not that gray, but it's gray enough where as soon as you see it, you're like, it's not white. So, and it's not even off-white either. It's actually gray. So that's one of the minor quibbles I have with this figure, as stoked as I am to have him. Another issue I have with Lobo is that, number two, his hair is too short. If you've read any of the Lobo comics, you know, especially the ones in the 90s, he had pretty long hair. This was a guy that came, he looks like he came out of like an old, like, heavy metal or like glam rock or, big hair band. This one, his hair is really short. It only comes down to like his chin, which throws me off. I know Lobo's been appearing in the Rebirth era, more recently in the comic. What is it, Crush and Lobo? And Crush is Lobo's daughter, so Lobo's actually been appearing in that book. But I don't remember his hair being as short as this. So that's one thing that's kind of bothersome also, is that his hair is shorter than it should be, or at least in my opinion. Like, for me, Lobo's very frozen in time in the 90s, and he should just have longer hair. But the advantage of having shorter hair is it does allow for more mobility, so he can rotate his head without having to worry about the hair like snagging onto his coat or like limiting his range of motion. But that's another minor quibble, is that his hair is too short. And another minor issue I have is that, as detailed as he is, I would have appreciated some additional paint application on his jacket, like especially with the metal spikes and studs throughout his jacket. It just seems kind of off that he has these cool metal spikes on the top of his leather jacket, but they're just left black. I can understand, they have to like keep the figure under a certain price point, especially in terms of manufacturing costs, but I would have appreciated it if, they kind of highlighted parts of the jacket that are supposed to be metal with some silver. But otherwise, great action figure, really well sculpted. It's unfortunate that I can't get the lighting to like shine properly on his face, just because I want you to see how detailed it is. But the light just bounces off of it, so any shadows or wrinkles that are there is just being washed out by the light. But yeah, it's a great figure. All right, now let's talk about the articulation. His head rotates. He could look down. He could look down, not that much, about there. Looking up is the same story. He's not really gonna look up. He's just gonna look forward. I'm guessing his hair is kind of like getting in the way. His arms rotate. They can go out. He does have a butterfly joint on the inside, as you can see right there. So there is some butterfly movement. Not a whole lot, but it's there. It's nice. I mean, it's nice that it is there. It's a little bit looser than some of the other figures we've gotten in the past. Bicep swivel, bicep cut, double pinned elbows. His wrists are articulated. Now, one thing with his wrists, unlike some of the other McFarlane figures, is that there's a ball on the inside, but it's cleverly covered by the wrist wraps right here. So even there's a ball joint, but at the same time, even though it covers the ball joint, it's kind of limiting the motion a little. So he could go in and out like this. But trying to move up, no, I take it back. The range of motion is there. So you could go from this position to like a neutral position. You can rotate it, you can close it in, going up. So yeah, I take it back. The articulation on the wrist is really fair. Even though it's covering the ball joint, which is a plus, because as you've known on some of the McFarlane figures, the ball joint's exposed and looks kind of weird. But on this one, it's a little bit more natural looking. So yeah, in terms of wrist articulation, much better than some of the other McFarlane figures we've gotten. He has a cut underneath his chest, right above his abdomen, and that allows for some movement. It allows him to crunch forward a little, like this. He can lean back, not so much. Waist articulation, he can rotate. Like many McFarlane figures, or all of them, he has that rubber diaper here. So it's very flexible. So this is nice and soft, which allows for him to kick forward like so, which is really good for a figure this size. And with it being that rubber diaper kind of deal, is that when you kick up, it almost looks seamless. But when you come back down, it gets kind of gappy, just a little bit. There is no thigh cut. In terms of a thigh swivel, this is all you'll get. I love the sculpting on these knee guards. They're kind of like this crowned skull with spikes on top. And it's a soft rubbery plastic. And when you bend his knees, which are double pinned, the knee guard does a good job of somewhat hiding the cuts on the top of the knee. But on the bottom, not so much. What would have been awesome is that, so there's some creative liberties here in terms of like the artist design, but what would have been cool is if they sculpted the bottom of the skull's jaw underneath, so that when you actually bent it down, it looked like the skull's opening. So I think that would have been cool, but unfortunately that's not the case. But I just thought it'd be a cool feature, like if you moved his knee up and down, it looked like the skull's actually like, you know, opening and closing like a real mouth. I love the shin guards here. Nice, sharp details, and these spikes, as sharp and as pointy as they look, they're just very soft rubber. So that's awesome. I love that. There is no boot cut, so there's no boot swivel. It's absent some paint application. So on the back, if you'd notice, there's these leather straps that hold that, you know, supposedly are what are holding the shin guards in place. But unfortunately, they're just left in that dark blue plastic. It would have been nice if they had additional paint application, so they'd color this leather band black and maybe add silver highlights to the belt buckle. So that would have been nice, but you know, for what they're giving us, I think it's all right. I would have appreciated more paint application, but I think in order to keep this figure at this price range, you know, certain sacrifices have to be made. Really well detailed boots. He has some rivets and steel tip toes. Here are the soles of his boots. Not a whole lot going on. And we cannot look at Lobo without taking a look at his trademark weapon. Let's get this out real quick. And what we have here is Lobo's chain and hook. And, you know, the character always wears his chain wrapped around the one forearm. Let's get that on there. But first off, just to let you know, this is all sculpted. It's a very soft, rubbery plastic. It's crazy because when you look at it, it looks nice. You know, you're getting some really sharp points, some really clean details. It almost has the appearance of this being a harder plastic, but the minute you handle it, it's so soft. It's such a soft, rubbery, pliable plastic. It's crazy. I love how it's like this giant and oversized like it should be, but it's really soft, very rubbery. And then over here, the chain unfortunately does not unfurl. It's just permanently sculpted like this. So it doesn't unroll. It's just going to be permanently left like that. So, you know, your only real option is that you're just going to have to just wrap it around the figure's hand and forearm and give him that trademark look. Like so. Yeah, so that's Lobo. I mean, it looks amazing. Really wonderful figure. If I had to rate this right, so let's talk numbers. If I had to rate this figure numerically on a scale of 1 to 10, all right, so I'm biased. My love for the character is an easy 10. But in terms of this action figure, it's great. If I had to break it down, the sculpting, a 10. The articulation, I want to say at least for the size and build of this character, I would say anywhere between an 8.5 to a 9. Just because Lobo, he's such a big, burly guy, but he still has all the articulation that you want him to have, and the range of motion is actually really good for a figure of this stature. You know, so the articulation is there. So for me, it's like, you know, 8.5 to a 9 in terms of articulation. The paint application, this is where it's gonna be kind of compromised. I want to say at least the lowest in 8, the highest in 8.5. He could use with some more paint. You know, like I said, it would have been nice if they painted the spikes on his jacket, if they painted the zippers and the buttons on his jacket, if they painted the straps on the back, that would have been cool. But what you do get is awesome as it is. You know, the patch on the back is well painted. The Bite Me Fanboy looks great. The hair, the blue does bother me a little. The blue highlighting, it's not as bad as it looked like in the marketing photos, but I kind of wish it would have been, instead of using blue highlights, if they used gray like we saw on the back of the box. I think that makes for a much more attractive figure. So yeah, it's a great figure. Don't get me wrong, I'm in love with it, but it's not perfect. You know, like for me, a perfect figure was kind of like either one of those Lex Luthor figures that we got from McFarlane. For me, those were perfect figures. There was no shortcomings on those. I guess maybe it's possible my expectations on this figure were a little high to begin with, just because he's one of my favorite comic book characters. But for a toy that you're getting at like $21, it's amazing. And it's Lobo. You know, if you're a big fan of Lobo, I don't think you'll be disappointed at all. You know, he falls short in a couple of areas, but it's an astounding figure. I mean, just look at that. You know, I do wish, you know, they could have gotten this flesh tones correct and matching. It's very disjarring for me to have his arms be gray, but his face be completely stark white. You know, he technically should just be completely stark white. But yeah, it's Lobo. Anyone that grew up in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and was just a fan of this character, this is kind of like your figure. This is the one we've been waiting for, and I have a feeling that this won't be the last we'll see of Lobo. Knowing McFarlane, they'll double dip, and they'll give us a repaint of this guy, and I'm sure when they do, maybe they'll give us a different head sculpt. Fingers crossed for me, I'm hoping that we get the much longer hair, if they ever re-release this figure, or even the Rob Zombie look. And since we're on the subject of Lobo, let's take a look at some of the other Lobo figures that were available. Okay, so right here is probably the most recent Lobo that we got. This is not to be confused with the DC Classics Build-A-Figure Lobo. This was during Mattel's final few years, if not their last year, holding the DC license. This came out under their Multiverse line, which was kind of like the heir successor to the Classics line. And with the Multiverse, they continued that tradition of the Build-A-Figure, and in this wave was actually the Lobo. So over here we have Lobo's head. This came with the Batman Beyond figure. And if you got all the different figures here, if you got Flash, if you got Batman Beyond, Kingdom Come, Superman, and Kyle Rayner, if you got all these characters, you'd be able to build Lobo right here. And I do have all the pieces, but much like the Lex Luthor also, I just can't bring myself to like open these boxes up just to assemble the figure. And if you look carefully too, it's kind of cool because they actually give us two different Lobo heads. There's one Lobo head, which was a little bit more modern when he had goggles. And then if you look underneath, there's the much more traditional Lobo head, which is kind of more in line with this guy here. And he looks great. If my only complaint with this figure is that he didn't look buff enough. Like, he already looks buff, but I like this one. This is nice and burly. Like, this is a guy that's going to go to a concert and it's like be in the mosh pit and it's like beat everyone to death. This is the kind of Lobo I love to see. This one looks cool. He looks burly, but he just doesn't look as crazy as this one does. But that doesn't take anything away from this. You know, I did want this figure, and I do have all the pieces. At the moment, I just can't bring myself to open up this box and assemble them, just because I don't have any DC figures on display anymore. Most of my DC figs are toted up in like, I think like 9 different boxes. And, you know, maybe one day I'll take him out, but for now, he's just going to remain unassembled and in individual pieces. So yeah, this is the Build-A-Figure Lobo that we got some years ago from Mattel when they had the DC Multiverse line. This is a fun Lobo. I bought this at Walmart sometime in the past year. This is from the Imagine Next toy line. It's a kids toy line, and this is from their DC Super Friends. And we have Lobo up here, which is crazy, right? The crazy thing about this Lobo is that he has that iconic Iron Cross on his vest. Now, the Iron Cross is kind of a controversial symbol. I think it has some negative connotations, so that's why it's not always used anymore on Lobo. Like the original Lobo character in the 90s, I believe he wore the Iron Cross around his chest, like on his neck. He had like on a chain. But for a lot of action figures, they kind of got rid of the red Iron Cross. Like I said, there's some negative connotations associated with the red Iron Cross. So I thought it was kind of weird that on the very kiddie toy for kids ages 3 and 8, it was just very weird that they decided to keep the Iron Cross on this figure. And this figure has the much more 80s haircut too. This is the very Simon Bisley style 80s haircut, where it's almost kind of like Wolverine, where it kind of like flays outward and upward. Whereas this one's kind of more like the heavy metal rocker Lobo, where it just kind of drapes over him. This is awesome because it's kind of like a reinterpretation of Lobo's space bike, but instead it just has full down wings, a giant rear wheel, and it comes with Dog, Lobo's faithful canine companion. And then, who is this tall, dark, and scary dude? When Lobo, the intergalactic bounty hunter, rolls into town with Dog tagging along, it's probably best to run and hide. Who do you think he's on the prowl for, little DC fans? So this is such a great toy line because as much as it's meant for little kids, this company knows that it's the grown adult who's buying it for themselves just so they could, have something to play with their kids. Because Lobo is not necessarily a character that little kids, Lobo never enters the conversation with a little child. This is something Dad loves, and this is something that Dad introduces to their kid, and I think it's a fun thing. So yeah, this is Lobo with his motorcycle. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the OG Lobo action figure. This is an action figure from way back when. If you're a Lobo fan from like the 90s and early 2000s, you'll recognize this. This came from DC, I think DC Direct. Before it was DC Essentials, before it was DC Collectibles. I think it was just known as DC Direct. And we have OG Lobo, which came with his space bike. And it also came with his faithful canine companion Dog right here. Just like the Imagine Next toy, but this is like, the grown-up version. So this is the Lobo action figure that we got way back when. I'm not sure what the date is on this. 2001. Yeah, so this figure is 20 years old. It came out under the DC Direct label, I believe. So for a long time, DC produced their own action figures. I think it was initially called DC Direct. Then it became DC Essentials. And then later, I think DC Collectibles. And this Lobo was awesome. It was a box set. And this really captured the look of the old 90s Simon Bisley character. Albeit it's missing some of the important things, like on the back. He doesn't have the awesome Bite Me Fanboy patch on his back. One thing he does have, which really indicates, this time period for this character, is that he has the leather jacket, but it's asymmetrical. When Simon Bisley drew Lobo in the 90s, especially in the original miniseries, one of his sleeves still remained intact on his coat. So he only had one torn off sleeve, and that was the one that had the chain. As you can see here, this one actually has a real chain, which is nice, but it's a pain in the butt because it's hard to keep it in place and wrapped on the fist and forearm properly. It always just wants to roll off. Here's that Iron Cross I talked about. So he has the Iron Cross worn around his neck. This one, much like this one, he does have the blue highlights in his black hair, but it's not too disjointed just because his black leather jacket has a lot of blue highlighting on it. So there's some consistency and flow to it. He has the asymmetrical legs. He has the one with the skulls and the metal shin guard. Whereas in the comic book, I believe the one knee might have been just covered with, I think, armor plating, and maybe like it was wrapped in a bandana. Oh, it's right there. So it's wrapped right there. He has grenades. Dog. It's essentially what it is. It's his pet dog. And then here's his bike. It was cool that they gave us this space bike that Lobo could ride, but in all honesty, the proportions are just off. Like, this looks perfect, but the front end looks too squat. It should have been probably like at least twice as long, so it should go here. But you have to remember, this was part of a box set, so for this to fit in the box, it had to be a certain size. And the handlebars can actually detach, which I'm kind of scared of because this plastic is that kind of plastic that snaps easily. So you can actually detach the handlebars like this and just carefully thread them back in. And then the engines come off. So this thing's kind of easy to store if you want to put it away. And if you want to seat Lobo inside of it, alright, so I'm not gonna. His joints are kind of stuck and frozen. You know, this is a 20-year-old action figure. I don't want to risk forcing him. So if his legs don't want to move, I'm not gonna move them. But essentially, you'd seat this figure inside of here. Let's see if I could get it in. Yeah, so he'd sit in it. It's kind of stupid because it's so small looking. So I mean, if anything, it looks like a rascal that you'd see like at Walmart. But it was just cool that they gave us that. And at the time, you know, it was just an awesome accessory. I mean, it was the early 2000s. You know, we were just grateful to have gotten a Lobo figure that was this cool. So yeah, for me, this is a really, really important piece of Lobo history. And his paint's kind of flaking off a little. So yeah, coming back to this guy, he's a long history. He's had a handful of really cool action figures. It makes me want to go and actually hunt down that Storm Collectibles one and even the original Mattel Build-A-Figure. But for what you're paying, this is a must-get. You know, especially with the DC Multiverse line, it's so heavily dependent on Batman and Superman that it's nice that we're getting a character that's not from those two universes. You know, Lobo's kind of his own thing. And it's awesome. So yeah, I highly recommend it. Alright, this is one of my longer videos just based on one action figure. So let's shut this thing down. Alright, so once again, my name is Lou. If you're new to my channel, welcome. If you are a returning viewer or subscriber, thank you so much for your likes, comments, and continued support. I greatly, greatly appreciate it. So until the next video, be safe, take care of yourself, and most importantly, be happy and buy lots of toys. And I'll see you at the next video. All right, later.